Ready.
Okay. You will hear my voice in your sleep tonight, see?
Yeah, right. We're in that side.
It takes a long time to get over the effects of these sessions. So, introduction to Leviticus. The Leviticus is called the priest book. Leviticus is the third of the 5 books attributed to Moses, and it comes from the Septuagint. The name comes to us in our Bible. It means pertaining to the Levites. Leviticus is a book often overlooked by Christians. One of the reasons for this is that it's really technical. It's about the priests and their work. And this is probably why the Jewish Mishnah refers to Leviticus as the priest book. Then we've already seen how important the Promised Land has been throughout Genesis and Exodus, that land. Leviticus contains God's special covenant instructions for the Levitical priests who were appointed as God's ministering agents to equip the people in knowing how to keep God central in every aspect of their common life in the land. So remember, we already were talking about in Exodus, we were talking about the law and all that. Okay, this is actually the administration of that law. So it's very important that God's chosen people will understand exactly how to approach His presence in worship, how to maintain a clean and holy life in God's midst, and how to carry out a holy desire within the land. So God's saying, I'm not leaving anything to chance. I still think it connects to that when judgment comes, God doesn't want anybody to have any excuse.
Right.
So He's got everything here. And even in these laws, as cold and complicated as they are sometimes, there's still types and shadows of Christ and then how we're supposed to live. And so God just wanted them to know. There was no guarantee that God's blessing would continue in the midst of the people if the Levites were to fail in their commission. So they were in charge, just like Adam was in charge of teaching Eve, and sin didn't enter through Eve, even though she sinned first, because Adam had the responsibility, so the Levite, the priesthood, had the responsibility. The many instructions that are found in Leviticus generally have to do with Israel's moral, religious, and civil life. And these instructions include required sacrifices and offerings, the annual religious calendar, priestly procedures, and when you're handling the holy things of God, for example, sacrifices, offerings, holy objects, the special feast days, procedures for ritual cleansing, food laws, rituals associated with worship, high priestly laws of order, and more. The Septuagint is the oldest Greek version of the Old Testament, and the work is designated by the Roman numerals LXX because of the tradition that there were 70 translators. The translation was made from the Hebrew Bible by Hellenistic Jews. A Hellenistic Jew, which Paul was one, a Hellenistic Jew was one who was a Jew that was reared or had lived in a Greek area. They were a lot of times born in the Greek area. Paul was in Troas. So, and it was written by Hellenistic Jew during the period, or Hellenistic Jews during the period of 275 to 100 BC at Alexandria. And the Septuagint was widely used by Greek-speaking Jews, but its adaptation by the Christians who used it in preference to the Hebrew original aroused hostility among the Jews, so they didn't use it anymore after about AD 70. And if you know your history, do you know what AD 70 means? You know what year that was or what happened? That was
right,
huh? 80 70. What happened? That was after Christ, and it was Constantine, not Constantine, but Titus came in and destroyed the temple. So anyway, that was about that time that they rejected that. So, but the reason I mention it is because it was from Hebrew original, and what we have now in our book of Leviticus was translated from the Septuagint, which has been rejected because of a rift between Orthodox Jews and Hellenistic Jews, and they quit using it, and they went to the Hebrew, but the Septuagint was a direct translation out of into the Greek by these 70 scholars, and it's reputed to be, or it seems to be, the most accurate translation of the Bible that there is, the Old Testament. And that is where we get the book of Leviticus that's in our Bible. It comes from that translation. So of what relevance is the book for those that are living in an age of grace? And actually, it has a lot of relevance. We may not believe it, but it really does. And first, we can't really understand the nature of Old Testament worship unless we read Leviticus. And second, Leviticus provides insights into the character of God. The book reveals that God is holy, just, merciful, passionate, and tenderhearted toward the needy and oppressed. And though God welcomes our approach, Leviticus warns us to take care that we come humbly by the way of grace and mercy, following God's revealed ways and not our own. So Leviticus tells us it's very important how we approach God. I think that comes down to the church too. It's very important how you approach God in services.
That's right.
Because there's a certain way to do it, and God does not want you hum-hoing and coming in and yawning and playing with your phone and doing all kinds of stuff. He's not happy with that. You think about it, you read Leviticus, he's very, very, very fixated on how you worship me. So, and thirdly, Leviticus emphasizes the importance of having a good relationship with God. The ancient Hebrews were told to be holy as God is holy.
Yes.
And this required a close relationship by living by faith and obedience. And finally, there is no other book in the Old Testament. Like no other book, Leviticus lays a foundation for understanding the key biblical and theological concepts of holiness, sacrifice, and atonement. You can't really teach holiness without going to the book of Leviticus. One of the big arguments today, you can't preach on that because that's out of the Old Testament. That's the law. That's just, that's not good. We're under grace. But the truth is, the foundation for holiness teaching is in the book of Leviticus. And so, it really means to be separate. The word holy is used 87 times in Leviticus. Sacrifice and synonyms occur 300 times in 27 chapters. Atonement is used over 49 times. So as Christians study Leviticus under the Spirit of God's tutelage, they are discovering how these themes functioned within the worship system of ancient Israel. And they come to better understand the heart of our holy God, as well as the deep significance of the atoning, saving work of Jesus Christ. So we need to understand, it's not legalism. So, that's so legalistic, It's founded in the Bible. We need to understand the character of a holy God. What did he require of them, and what does he require of us? Do you think he requires less of us than he did of them?
No.
I don't think so either. So in many ways, Leviticus is to the Old Testament what Romans is to the New Testament. Because it serves as a theological heart, as its theological heart, as it reveals what exactly it means to call God holy. And to have a share in his gracious offer of forgiveness and life in him, and to look for God's promised provision. R.K. Harrison says of Leviticus, it is a work of towering spirituality, which through the various sacrificial rituals points the reader unerringly to the atoning death of Jesus, our great high priest. An eminent 19th century writer once described Leviticus quite correctly as the seedbed of New Testament theology. For in this book is to be found the basis of Christian faith and doctrine. So that is R.K. Harrison, his book on Leviticus. Now, Leviticus functions, at least in part, like a procedural manual or a legal handbook. It contains very little narrative. Leviticus lends itself nicely to a little outline, very simple outline, in two main sections, chapters 1 through 16, which is the way into fellowship with God, and then chapters, the way into God, fellowship with God is sacrifice, and then chapters 17 through 27, the walk of fellowship with God, separation. So look at the detailed outline. There, chapters 1 through 10 is offerings to be made by the people. Chapters 1 through 6, instructions for the priest. Chapter 6 through 10, ritual cleansing. Chapter 11 through 15, various regulations. Chapter 11 and 12, instructions for the priest. Chapter 13 and 14, additional regulations. 15, that's under ritual cleansing, and then the Day of Atonement. Chapter 16 and chapter 17. That includes instructions for the priest. Chapter 16, instructions for the people. Chapter 17. Then in chapters 18 through 22, we have the heading Holiness. Under Holiness, instructions for the people in holiness. Chapter 18 through 20, instructions for the priest. Chapter 21 through 22. And then the annual worship calendar, chapter 23 through 25. And the additional instructions, chapter 26 and 27. Then, when was this written? Leviticus makes the claim that its instructions were given directly to Moses on Mount Sinai while leading the Israelites through their 40-year sojourn in the wilderness. So all that time they were spending at Sinai, God is giving the book of Leviticus these instructions. We encounter the phrase, "and the Lord called to Moses," 25 times in the book. At least once in every chapter except chapters 2, 3, 9, 10, and 26. Hill and Walton conclude the following: when all available evidence is taken into account, there are no compelling reasons for denying the antiquity and authenticity of the book of Leviticus. And we see there's two dates. There's a late date, 1290 BC. Then there's a early date of 1450 BC. And there's reasons for the two. And if you read this manuscript and go back into Genesis, you can read the early and late date and how it was brought. The book itself reveals that many of the revelations recorded in Leviticus were given to Moses following the Exodus, while communing with God in the tent of the meeting and on Mount Sinai. And though we might date the origin of the material in Leviticus to somewhat immediately following the Exodus, we will never know whether Moses himself wrote down and compiled this material or simply dictated these revelations to scribes to write down. The priests and the Levites. The Israelites gathered to eat the first Passover meal on the eve of the Exodus. The blood of the Passover lambs marked the doorposts of the homes as the angel of death moved through the land of Egypt, taking all the firstborn of the land. On that very night, God also claimed the firstborn of all Israel to be his very own. Then God declared, "I have taken the Levites from among the Israelites in place of the first male offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine." So in other words, he laid claim to the firstborn of every family, but he said, "I'm going to trade that. And I want all the Levites. They're going to be mine." So the Levites came into prominence in connection with Moses and Aaron, who themselves were Levites. So after the events surrounding the golden calf, it was the Levites who rallied to Moses and stood with him against the open rebellion. They put on their swords, and the sons of Levi avenged the Lord's honor by following Moses' command to slay 3,000 of their brothers who led this rebellion. And this display of faithfulness is probably partially the account for the significant role that was given to the Levites. God honored them. So in the Pentateuch, a distinction is always made between priests and Levites. It's right on down to Jesus' day, the priests and the Levites. It's still a distinction. Only those who were directly descendant of Aaron qualified as a priest. And that was a privilege reserved for them alone on penalty of death. So anybody that stepped into a priest's role that was not a priest would die. All other Levites were to be dedicated to an auxiliary ministry on behalf of the priests. So they were. They were to focus on caring for the tabernacle and attending to its upkeep and ongoing work. And whenever the people were called upon to advance through the wilderness, the Levites carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, as well as the other articles of the tabernacle, Levites. Then, when people encamped, the Levites were to stand before the Lord to minister and pronounce blessings in his name. This notion of the Levites belonging to God is reinforced by the fact that when the people would finally enter the land of promise, the Levites would be given no land to call their own. Their inheritance would be a priestly service to the Lord, Joshua 18:7. They would remain as God's special agents, ministering to the Lord and helping God's people stay in a right relationship with him by maintaining an atmosphere conducive to worship. God says, I need a ministry. So God would not leave the Levites without practical provisions. And that's why the Israelites were instructed to give the Levites all the tithe in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they did at the tent of meetings, Numbers 18:21. Theirs was a holy calling, not only doing the work at the tent of meeting, which was the tabernacle, but also bearing the responsibility for offenses against it, Numbers 18:23. The priests then were special Levites, and still not all those who were born to the Levitical house of Aaron would become priests. Only those who were free from all physical defects could share in this privilege. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 16 through 23. So in order to provide for the families of the Levites, God instructed Moses to command the Israelites to give the Levites towns to live in from their inheritance. The Israelites will possess, that they were going to possess in the land. He said, I want you to give them towns that will be Levitical towns. And that's their inheritance. And give them pasture lands around the towns, in Numbers 35 and 2. One of the special provisions of God to the Levites and their families was the privilege of eating from the sacrifices made to the Lord by fire, Deuteronomy 18:1. In other words, they sat down every day to eat from God's table. Another special provision that was given to the Levites were some of the very valuable skins of the sacrificed animals. And through the tithes of the people and the meals that were given to God and the animal skins, God more than provided for these set-apart servants of God. God said they have to be provided for, and this is how it will be. And they probably, and did, live a very, very good life because God provided. You know, God is a very, very good boss.
He is.
So, we look at this Old Testament law that was, when we look at the book of Leviticus, Mosaic law is categorized in 4 divisions. Moral laws. These are timeless laws that regulate human relationships, the lives of people living together, encouraging a more loving society. 6 of the 10 commandments are fall into the category of living together. 5 through 10. Honor thy father and thy mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false witness. Do not covet. There were religious laws, and those were also timeless laws that were given to regulate the relationship between God's people and himself. 4 of the commandments fall under that heading. Commandment 1 through 4. No other gods, no idols, do not take the Lord's name in vain, and keep the Sabbath. There were some ceremonial / ritual laws. These laws constitute the largest block of Old Testament laws and are mostly liturgical regulations for Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system that they were to administer. Though there were a lot of things, dietary regulations regarding food and preparation, as well as various regulations aimed at keeping Israel separate, set apart, holy from other nations. God sought to keep Israel separate for a season in order to use Israel to eventually touch all nations by giving a pure revelation of himself to Israel. And I have some illustrations and there are some quotations. But the New Testament is clear that the ceremonial laws were removed when the coming of Christ came. And there's two reasons. First, Jesus put an end to ceremonial law by fulfilling or completing the intent of the law. The book of Hebrews is expressly given to demonstrate that Jesus and his work provided the very substance of ceremonial law that was given to foreshadow. It was a foreshadow. And so it's been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So we don't have that anymore in effect because we have Jesus. Secondly, the gospel of Jesus Christ is good news for all nations as God seeks to include the Gentiles among his people, making one people out of many. Then there were civil laws. These are the laws that had to do with Israel's life under a theocracy, a government set up by God to be directly accountable to God's will. That has always been God's will, to have a theocracy. If you want to know what God's will is for Israel today, it's a theocracy. He wants to rule Israel as the king, you might say. So civil laws specify penalties for several crimes, major and minor, that people might be arrested for and tried in Israel. And ancient laws, civil laws, applied only to citizens of ancient Israel. They're no longer to be directed or observed in our day. And they actually still, in Israel, they have their Old Testament laws that it's kind of a mismatch over there. And there's some things that cannot be tried by the state. They're under religious law. And so they have a whole different deal, and it's all right here. It goes right back to the book of Leviticus. So which laws are for us today? And so here's a general principle for answering that particular question. The contemporary believer must obey all laws which were not intended solely for the special circumstances of the Old Covenant. So you need to really look at differences between the Old and New Covenants. The purpose of many Old Covenant laws, especially ceremonial and ritual laws, look forward to their fulfillment in the person and work of Jesus Christ. That has to do with all the sacrificial laws, has to do with the tabernacle and all those things. And Paul said that in Colossians, he said, these are a shadow of things that were to come. The reality, however, he said, is found in Christ. So some people observe the dietary restrictions and whatnot, but it's not necessary because it was fulfilled in Christ. Number two is the Old Covenant involved a physical external kingdom. The New Covenant involves an internal spiritual kingdom. The Old Covenant was Moses. The Jews today live under that covenant. The New Covenant is Jesus. We live under that covenant as Christians. And that's why the Jews have trouble with the Christians, because we're under two different covenants. So we don't subscribe to the Mosaic covenant anymore, except we do understand that we have to respect God, and we have to honor him, we have to worship him, we have to approach him in the right way. We have to be a separate people, because the church, in fact, is the called out one. So we didn't get away from that separation. But the Old Covenant required an elaborate tabernacle or temple where God is said to dwell. But in the New Covenant, the people are the dwelling place of God. They are the living stones, so God dwells in us. The old one required ritual washing for extreme purity, but the New Covenant brought a cleansed heart for purity with inward. The Old Covenant forbid marrying foreigners out of physical Hebrew descent, and not of physical Hebrew descent, but The new covenant is no marrying unbelievers who are not of the same spiritual descent. So we're still not supposed to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. The Old Testament lays out a list of unclean foods. The New Testament says the inner focus on unclean thoughts and words becomes the emphasis. The ancient church, God's people, and the state were ruled by the same government under the Old Covenant, a theocracy. But that's not the case in the New Covenant. Since physical descent is no longer the emphasis under the New Covenant, the state should not try to enforce laws to regulate a person's relationship to God. And that's one of the basic tenets of this country. That we have the freedom of worship. So our relationship to God is totally aside from any other relationship we have, and the state has no right to touch it. Amen, Brother Weiser. Love and protection revealed in strange laws. God's goodness and care for Israel was revealed in some very strangest laws. You can read that. I was just trying to see if any of that's really that important, but you can read that yourself. I have a lot of quotations from theologians in there on some of those. Hebrew laws and the laws of its neighbors. The laws of the Hebrews differed greatly from their neighbors in some very fundamental ways. First of all, among Israel's neighbors, kings were usually treated as the ultimate authority for all moral, civil, and religious laws. The ancient records reveal that in Babylon and other Mesopotamian civilizations, kings were thought to be above the law. Pentateuch presents Moses not a final authority for the people, but a mediator of God's covenant, a divinely appointed spokesman for God. So God was Israel's lawgiver and king. And again, theologians use the word theocracy to describe a system of government that God rules. God gave his laws for the people and then appointed human judges and leaders to administer his laws. Moses was a mediator, and that is basically the action of the minister today, but God rules. God rules. Let me go on. Let me talk about uncleanness in Leviticus. We're skipping down because we got to hurry through here. One of the many duties of the Levitical priests, and I want you to read whatever I skip over if you want to, at least enough to answer those questions. But I think it's good, it's just good information. One of the many duties of the Levitical priest was to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the clean and the unclean. Leviticus 10:10. And the concept of cleanness is foreign, very confusing to us. Cleanness is not the same as cleanliness. And it actually has little to do with hygiene, but more to do with fitness. A thing is fit for worship or appropriate for worship if it is clean. God desires cleanness. Something or someone that is unclean may not enter God's presence in worship. God used this concept of the clean and the unclean to help the Israelites understand his holiness and what it means to be right before him. Leviticus 10 shares a strange story about two priests who approached God offering unauthorized fire. And according to the text, this act was a direct violation of God's revealed will for priests. And by engaging in such actions, Nadab and Abihu stood before God in an unclean manner. Both priests immediately died in God's presence. They were to be thought of as unclean because they had not followed God's exact prescription for approaching him. These priests had done what was fitting. They had not done what was fitting for worship. They went their own way. Oh, well, I've got a better idea. You know how that goes with some people. I'm not going to do it that way. I've got a better idea. I'm going to do it this way. But that's not the way it should be done. Well, that's okay. I'm going to do it my own way. Well, when you do that with God, in fact, a lot of us would be dead if God still had that same attitude as far as the Christian church is concerned. But anyway, they were killed God said, I'm not going to have that. So what makes eagles and lizards and menstruation and mildew unclean, whereas locusts and goats and baldness are not unclean? It seems that all things that are deemed unclean tend to share one of two characteristics. One having to do with blood and the other having to do with deterioration in general, as in the case of mildew. Simply put, seems to be a principle at work that clean things affirm life itself. Clean things affirm life. Unclean things in some way affirm death, or bring about the deterioration of living things, or vital relationships. And consider how that plays out with clean and unclean animals. Uncleanness during the menstrual cycle, childbirth, and the uncleanness of sickness and disease and fungus. Clean and unclean animals. You know, Leviticus introduces two types of animals, clean and unclean. Only clean animals were accepted. They were fit for food, and in some cases for specified sacrifices. And generally speaking, these animals considered clean were herbivores, where those considered unclean were carnivores. Why is that distinction? The distinction reinforces three biblical concepts. Number one, blood symbolizes life. It is the biblical metaphor for life itself. Life is in the blood. Life must be valued and protected at all costs. And there must be no shedding of innocent blood. Those are three basic biblical concepts. I have a lot of things there that you can look up. A full explanation and example listing unclean and clean creatures can be found in chapter 11 of Leviticus and Deuteronomy 14, 1 through 21. And if you take that, you'll see in your manuscript, but also in your test, there is a checklist where you can go down and check off if it's clean or unclean. The first one, if it's clean, and the second one, if it's unclean, on through this list. So there are explanation, uncleanness during times of menses and childbirth. Why did bloody discharges during menses and childbirth make a woman unclean, so that she may not enter the sanctuary or the tabernacle until she's been purified? Leviticus 12:4. Again, to the Israelites, the loss of blood suggested that the woman is no longer enjoying the fullness of life and perfect health. She appears to be losing life rather than gaining life, and so she has to be cleansed before God, who is the author and the sustainer of all life. The uncleanness of sickness and disease and fungus, and that seems a bit harsh, but it has to do with what is in the process of death. All things are clean in Christ. When we come into the New Testament, is there value for the new covenant believer in studying the concepts of cleanliness, of cleanness in the Pentateuch? Yes, there is great value in this study. First, it should be acknowledged that Christ has now declared all foods to be clean. So you can read several things. I think about when Peter was supposed to go to the household of Cornelius, and God gave him a vision, and there was all these things. Everything was unclean, and he said, "Arise and eat." And he said, "I'm not going to eat anything that's unclean." And the Lord said, "What I have cleansed, call thou not unclean." So he came there because even though he was a Jew and it was against his teaching, he came anyway, because Jesus Christ had cleansed all food. We don't have to worry. Now, I'm not saying all food is good for you. But there were principles in the law of clean and unclean that if you look at if you read this, and I think maybe told you enough that you can get it. It was those principles about things that are in the process of death, things that are in the process of decay. There were principles there that God wanted in Scripture, but in the New Testament, Jesus fulfilled all those types. So some things we need to do, but some things we don't need to do. Now, what I want you to do also is look up the reference and study as an exercise, the cleanness rules. And you see there all those, and it may be in your test too, but if it's in your test, it's just, you just need to go look it up and study that out, why it was in Scripture. You know, it's good that we're studying theology, so it's probably a good thing to read the Bible, you think?
Yeah.
So, all right, let's go to session 8, and we're going to take a break in a little bit here, but we'll go for a while longer because we're getting down there, and I'm kind of going along. Old Testament tabernacle and temple sacrifices. So, fine meal, meat, grain, wine were components of almost every single sacrifice, according to Numbers 15, 1 through 10. The animal sacrifice was like serving an excellent meal to a guest. God's presence was symbolized both by the altar as well as the fire that was upon the altar, and by burning or cooking the animal and the bread and throwing the wine on the side of the altar. Worshipers were showing hospitality to God, who is their heavenly guest. We have to look at all these as types. God is just trying to impress, I think, that how important he is, how important approaching him the right way is, how important a relationship with him is. So he's like taking a bunch of kindergartners and saying, you know, I've got to teach these kindergartners all these principles, and I've got to somehow, I can't leave anything to chance. I've got to put it all down there, no matter what. And, you know, you feel like as a child, like they might be saying, I know that. How many times do you have to say that? But you know what? He said things over and over and over, and they still forgot. Right? So, through these sacrifices, God provided food for the servants of the tabernacle, their families, the Levitical priest. Meat, bread, wine became the staples of the priest's diet. So, they had a very nice, really life, you know. They had the meat, they had the bread, they had the wine. I think they dined very good. People had to bring the best that they had. And God wanted that, so he said, you know what? Basically, the priests ended up with their portion of the best that they had, the Levites that they had. And so God took care of that situation, but it was not in honor of the people, the priest or the Levites, but it was the respect for God, because they represented him. So that was what was behind it. But anyway, when we look at the animal sacrifices, a lot of it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And it's so difficult to really understand the ancient Israelite sacrificial system. Many people are even disgusted. Animal rights people probably would have a hard time. I'm sure that they must have a hard time. They don't mind the New Testament, but I don't think they would have very good a feeling about the Old Testament. But it's, you know, first of all, I believe that we should take care of our animals. I really do. But I also believe that some of the people that are such these big animal advocates also are abortionists. They believe in abortion. So what I think is more important is human life and not animal life. But anyway, I think that you have to look at what God is trying to teach. And that animals were placed, and here's the theme. There's a theme. All this is theme. Back in the garden, the animals were placed there for man and for woman. They were placed for them. And God took an animal and slew it, and he put garments on them. Now, God connects something about covering and blood with atonement. So we shouldn't argue with God. If we have a question, let's ask God about it whenever we have a chance. But I have a feeling God, I know God had a very good reason. So many people are just disgusted at the thought of sacrificing animals. Others say, well, I don't really have many qualms about the animal part, but I just think it's a very strange way to worship. So how can we understand this activity? You know, what are you trying to say, God? You know, the Israelites were really not alone in animal sacrifices. There were many Canaanite religions that had peace offerings, whole or burnt offerings, similar to the Hebrews. There were, however, some distinctions. There were some distinctive differences with respect to the meaning of those sacrifices and their functions within their various belief systems. Other ancient cultures believed that the gods actually lived off of the people's sacrifices. So they thought of themselves as feeding their gods. But the Israelites didn't view sacrifices that way. God revealed in Exodus that he could not be fed at the hands of human beings. And the sacrifices we see in the Old Testament sacrificial system are more often intended to be substitutionary or representative in nature. The sin offering is one example. You know, the worshiper was instructed to lay his or her hands on the animal's head, confessing his or her sin, then the animal was slaughtered. What is being implied here is that the animal is being offered as a substitute of the worshiper. The killing of the animal and the pouring out of the lifeblood symbolizes the death that the offerer actually deserved for the sin. So, you know, there are so many things in the belief system that are different than this, and Hill and Walton list a number, and I'll just go through these. The Hebrew belief in direct revelation from Yahweh and his appearance in the theophanies, that was a difference between the Hebrews and the Israelite belief system and the Canaanite culture. Also, the Hebrews' belief in a strict monotheism, that was very unusual because most of the false religions did not believe in one God. Their belief about the origin and the impact of sin on humanity, the highly ethical and moral nature of the Hebrew faith in contrast with the Canaanite fertility cults. And if you ever go to Israel and you're lucky enough to see the museum for religious antiquities, they have so many of those old Canaanite idols centered around fertility cults in there. The conviction regarding Yahweh's holy and righteous character as contrasted with pagan deities. Also, Yahweh's firm prohibition against any form of human sacrifice. When thinking about the matter of sacrifice, it is helpful for modern readers to remember that most Hebrew people would have barely scraped out a living. You know, some like Abraham obtained great fortunes, but the majority of people were relatively poor by our standards. Any sacrifice might be very costly, especially the sacrifice of one's best, whether it's from the animals or from the grain. So even in our own day, animals often represent a poor person's long-term savings. So in such cases, the sacrificing of one's animal to God was an act of great generosity and personal devotion. And this is why sacrifices were often described as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. In Leviticus 1, 9, 13, and 17, those verses. Actions like these called for faith in God and required a commitment to his purposes. Acceptable animal sacrifices. All sacrificial animals had to be clean and domesticated. A deer was, even though it was clean, it was a clean animal, it wasn't a sacrifice animal that was acceptable. Even though it was clean because it didn't eat meat, it ate only grass, but it still was not acceptable for sacrifice. You say, well, why is that? Because deer could be found in abundance in the wild. And so you could go out and you could get a deer, but all domesticated animals were part of the Israelites' livelihood. So a worshiper had a personal investment in the sacrifice when he or she raised the animal or purchased it. Can you imagine if you raised a lamb and how a child has a propensity to name their pet.
Yep.
And so the little one, this lamb is going to be offered as a sacrifice. And the little girl, that's her little pet. And she loves her little lamb. And so, or anything else, you know, whatever. Yeah, but Bambi was okay because she couldn't be offered, so you're safe with Bambi. Anybody, anything you domesticated was a part of your livelihood. The best thing to do is, if mom and dad are wise and they want to sacrifice, keep that lamb away from the kids. But the truth is, the principle was that God wanted what cost you. See, David said, I will not sacrifice the Lord. Remember, they gave him, I think it was water, and he poured it out. And they said, why? He said, I will not sacrifice to the Lord, my God, burnt offerings that cost me nothing.
Oh, wow.
So that was a principle. There was a cost involved. And so God is as much as interested in the sacrifice as he is in the offering.
The offering, wow.
So I think it's true. I mean, those principles never go away. They're still true. But second, somebody's very late to class. The second, all sacrificial animal offerings had to be without blemish. So what this did was it ensured that people would not offer sickly creatures. You know, it's like some people, it's like I heard about this guy, he had 10 apples. And so he said, wow, and they were so nice, they were so luscious and wonderful. And he said, I love these apples. So he said, I'm going to take this one apple, it looks good, I'm going to put this over here, that's God's apple. But then he got to looking at it, he said, you know what, God doesn't need that apple, this over here wasn't quite as good, that'll be God's apple. So he ate the 9 apples, then here's the 10, he's going to give this one to God. He said, oh, that looks good. So he said, well, I'll just take a bite out of this apple. It's okay, God won't mind that, and most of the apple. Then another apple, then another apple, then another bite, and another bite, and another bite. And finally, he put the core of the apple on the altar. That's what made it to the altar, was the core of the apple. And that's what he called a sacrificial offering. People would do that. Say, well, I got this cow over here, I think she has anthrax. Let's put this cow on the altar. And the priest, he's going to get anthrax from eating this old sickly cow. And but you think God's going to take that cow? No, God says you don't try that. It's got to be perfect. It's got to be without blemish. Yes.
Pastor, Leviticus 27:31 teaches that if you use your tithe, you got to pay a penalty.
Yeah, I think that should be put up.
Yeah.
No,
lot
if
of
the
people-
IRS can do it, why can't we do
A
it?
lot of people don't know that.
No, I know. That's true. That's true. But there are people that do believe that.
I had a friend, I told it to him, and his business was off. And he paid the penalty. As soon as he paid the penalty, his business rebounded.
You know, I know there's a lot of people that do believe that. Their first fruits go to God, and if they don't do it, they pay a penalty for doing that. I know a lot of people that do believe that. But anyway, that's what this principle is. Kind of the principle here is just it's got to be the best. So anyway, there's a chart here about the offerings, and it's about the name of the elements and the procedure and the significance of the offering. And I think it would be a good thing for you to read through. For these offerings. So let's look at, as we look at this, let's look at the high priest. And you can go back and read, there's a chart here for you to read. There's a lot of why God requires it. But I think there's some things I want to highlight before we're finished. And I will be sending out the manuscript right away for the tabernacle, so we can get started studying that. And by the way, you have the entire time that we're studying and even beyond to do the tests. You don't have to worry over it, but just don't let it get ahead of you too far. You know, keep kind of working at it, but there's no time limit particularly. When we meet together, my thing is that just do as much of it in class as you can, and then shouldn't leave too much for you to do afterwards. So anyway, let me look at Jesus' role as high priest. It's foreshadowed in the Levitical laws. How long have I been talking on this last deal?
Second. I don't know. About an hour almost.
On this last session? Oh, okay, well then I can break right here. Let's take about a 5-minute break.